Gaggle what we challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It's now 9:10 p.m. in, yes, you guessed it, very dark, sunless, increasingly cold, and uninviting city of Budapest, and it's still only the earliest days in November. So thank you very much, everybody who has joined me for our Tuesday night live stream. Always appreciate your company. And I know there are a few things to talk about. Obviously, there's the election. We'll talk a little bit about the election. Um, and so, a friend Peter Kovic has said, "Would you I prefer in the win the New York City mayoral race?" So we'll talk about the that race. And but I want to start off with the big news of the death of the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney. Um, I mean, one of the things that is so striking about the commentary about Cheney is how he's being presented as this, this figure with a strong set of ideas, set of principles, set of ideology, and that he somehow had imposed his view of the world on the Bush administration. He really wasn't like that. Um, I actually met him some years ago. I met him when he was defense secretary under Bush the elder, George H.W. Bush. And this had to have been around 1991. Um, I attended a dinner that was organized by the American Spectator because its founder and editor in chief, Bob Terrell, used to hold these dinners that would have regular guests who were very important people in Washington. And one of those guests was Dick Cheney. As I say, at the time he was defense secretary. So he was an important figure, big limos outside, security people, and everything else. And so I got invited to this dinner. And I even asked a question. I can't remember what I asked. I don't think it was a very good question. And to be honest, I wasn't actually planning on asking a question because there were a lot of other people there who were, since I didn't live in Washington, but I thought, they were all much more attuned to the issues of Washington than I was. So, I would let them ask Secretary Cheney a question. But nonetheless, Tyrrell turned to me, which I wasn't expecting, and asked me to ask a question. So I was a little, since I wasn't expecting it, I just had to think very quickly a question to ask the defense secretary, and so I didn't really come up with a particularly good question. I'm pretty sure it wasn't. He politely answered, but I don't think I asked anything terribly interesting. Um, but anyway, the point was that even then he struck me as being someone who was very au fait with the ways of Washington. He knew how Washington worked, and he knew all the right things to say to all the right people. He always seemed like a very safe pair of hands, and he fit in with the ethos of the George H.W. Bush administration, which was a very effective organization. They all, they were all people who knew their place, and they worked very effectively as a team. So remember, you had James Baker as Secretary of State. Baker had been chief of staff for Ronald Reagan. So he'd started off as working for George H.W. Bush during the 1980 campaign. So he worked for Bush against Reagan. But Reagan, after Reagan secured the nomination, um, he obviously saw the talents of Baker. So Baker became his chief of staff. And he ran that White House quite effectively during his first term. And then Baker decided that he wanted to run a department. He was getting tired of running a White House, and he decided he wanted to run a department. And so he swapped jobs with Reagan's Treasury Secretary, who was Don Regan. But for some reason, Regan, who was he was a very successful investment banker, he used to work at Merrill Lynch, and but he seemed to, he wanted to run the White House, and he made an absolute hash of it because he got on very badly with Nancy Reagan, and I think even Baker subsequently explained that being White House chief of staff is a staff job. You're not running a department; you're running a staff for the boss. And if you're working for a president, you really do have to pay attention to the president's wife. And but Reagan, he kind of, he spent all of his life in Wall Street and had some of the somewhat disdainful attitude towards women that many in Wall Street used to have. I mean, he didn't think much of them, and he certainly didn't think very highly of Nancy Reagan, and wanted to minimize her influence. Well, of course, Nancy Reagan really didn't appreciate it, and so when Iran Contra blew up, he was gone. I mean, it was naturally he had to take the blame for the fact that there was such an almighty cock up within the White House, because it was clearly the whole thing in Iran Contra was within the White House, with Oliver North and the National Security Council and Poindexter and everything else. So Reagan took the blame, and he was gone. But the point that I was making is that Cheney fit in very well with the figures like Baker and Colin Powell and I've forgotten who was the who was and Brent Scowcroft, who was Bush's national security advisor. So they worked very effectively as a team. And what I'm saying is that he never had any very strong views on anything really, because he was a very good manager. He just knew how to run things. He knew how to always be on top of the material. Always seemed very effective. And so when during the first Iraq War of 1990 and through to 1991, George H.W. Bush, who was totally lacking in any kind of charisma, any kind of popular appeal. He was just very waspy, but quite an effective administrator. He just he just wasn't very good at being a president. A president has to be kind of entertaining. He has to be a leader. And, he lacked any of those qualities. He was just quite an efficient administrator. But anyway, it was Bush who set a very limited goal in terms of what he wanted to achieve when he went after Saddam Hussein. And basically, his goal was, well, we're just going to drive out Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, but we are not going to march on to Baghdad in order to topple Saddam Hussein. This aroused the fury, absolute enrage of obviously the Israel lobby, because the Israel lobby was absolutely determined to get Saddam Hussein out in 1991. And then, of course, you had the neocons who started frothing at the mouth at Bush's very limited goal. And Bush said, "This is going to be we're not going to do regime change in Baghdad. All we're going to do is the limited goal that we set ourselves, and which Bush secured UN Security Council resolutions to enforce, which is to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, and that's what they did. And so they went there, and of course, um, he, Cheney carried out the orders as required, and he would often appear on television and said, well, we just this is our limited goals. We never said we were going to topple Saddam Hussein. We just wanted to get him out of Kuwait. Now, this, as I say, the administration really came under attack by the neocons for keeping Saddam Hussein in power. More seriously, for the Bush administration, was that he's then used this opportunity of this because Bush had built up this coalition of all these Arab states who had joined the United States in fighting Saddam Hussein. Now, of course, they didn't do any fighting, but they supported this, and then you of course had the Saudi Arabia was on board, and everyone else, and so Bush said, the one country I don't want any help from to go after Saddam Hussein is Israel. I don't want anything from Israel. I want Israel to keep a great distance from what we're trying to do with Iraq. And that was when I first really became aware of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu was then the Israeli ambassador to the UN, and he would always be getting interviewed, and he would obviously be ranting and raving about Saddam Hussein, but he was told, we want Israel to stay the hell out of this adventure, because if Israel were to join the United States in going after Iraq, all of the United States' Arab allies would abandon the project. So basically said, no, we want all the Arabs on board. Now, this, of course, added more fuel to the fire of the neocons, because they're saying, well, what the Bush administration prizes allies from the Arab world more than it prizes its greatest, closest, most wonderful friend that it has in the world, namely Israel. But that was certainly the case. So after the success of the military Operation Desert Storm, to oust Saddam Hussein from Iraq, without getting any help from Israel, Bush said, well, I got to give something to the Arab world. And so he organized the Madrid Conference, which involved the United States and the Soviet Union as the co-chairman of the Madrid Conference, and and a number of Arab states. But the significant part of it was that the Palestinians were included in Madrid. Now, the Palestinians were included as part of a Jordanian Palestinian delegation, but nonetheless, it was still diplomatic representation for the Palestinians that the United States had accepted. They knew perfectly well that the Palestinians in that Jordanian Palestinian delegations included members of the PLO. which the United States had deemed to be a terrorist organization. Um, so Bush went ahead with Madrid. Israel really didn't want to go. Absolutely fought tooth and nails about attending, but nonetheless they forced the Israeli presence, and and then Israel, Israel was forced to make all kinds of commitments, and of course Israel eventually managed to worm its way out of. But nonetheless, the Madrid conference kind of created this international framework for settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What then happened? Bush was gone. Bush lost the 1992 election after having come under a great deal of attack from the neoconservatives. So all this, and also keep in mind, this was the moment when Bush and Baker had vetoed loan guarantees for Israel because these loan guarantees were being used to build settlements on occupied territories. And so they said, hey, this is, U.S. policy is opposed to the settlements on occupied territory. So how do you can't very well expect us to guarantee loans for you to pursue a policy that is contrary to the policy of the United States. So, but that he came under a huge amount of attack on that, all of which, of course, helped defeat Bush in the fall. And Bill Clinton, of course, was attacking the Bush administration for stabbing Israel in the back. But in any case, what Clinton then did was he went ahead with the Oslo process. The Oslo process was, of course, one that was tailor made for the Israelis because Israel could just simply, essentially, manipulate things to its own advantage. The Palestinians were there pretty much on their own, and of course, the United States and Israel one corner, and then Palestinians on the other. Well, obviously, you knew exactly how Oslo would end up, and we've seen how Oslo ended up. But what I'm saying is that Cheney went along with all of that. That was and he was very much a part of that Bush team, and he would regularly defend the decision of the Bush administration not to do regime change in Iraq and leaving Saddam Hussein in power. But then what happened is that during the 1990s, then you had the neocons kind of organize themselves through the Project for the New American Century, run by Bill Kristol. Then they had their own magazine, their own horrible little magazine, the Weekly Standard, also edited by Bill Kristol. And then they had these figures like Kristol, Kagan, and then you had that Israeli think tank, essentially a Likud think tank, that a number of the people who were in the project with New American Century also were involved with this think tank. And they came up with that project. I can't remember what year it was, about towards a new Middle East, or I've forgotten the exact name of the project. But basically, it was toppling Saddam Hussein. And so throughout the 90s, there was a steady drumbeat from the neoconservatives that Saddam Hussein was the source of all the problems in the Middle East. Leaving him in power was the the most egregious mistake the United States had ever made. So this was and then, so of course, when Bush the younger came back, he seemed to have taken on board the neocon message. Remember, his father had really didn't like the neoconservatives at all. He kind of kept them very much at a distance. He hired Dan Quayle as his VP. Not clearly wasn't a very bright bulb, and Bush Sr. knew that Quayle wasn't a very bright bulb, but Quayle kind of hired these neocons. So Bill Crystal was Dan Quayle's chief of staff, and then so they had all these foreign policy advisors, but they were all working for Dan Quayle. I mean, he's the vice president. He didn't have any input in anything. I mean, Bush didn't take him terribly seriously, and he was never involved in any of the policy meetings. So he was just there as a kind of a pretty boy that Bush kind of hired, and nobody could ever exactly understand why Bush named Dan Quayle as his running mate. But that was the neocons who Bush despised, detested, and so they were around Dan Quayle. And then after the 1992 election, which had led to the defeat of Bush, and of course they were all delighted. The neocons were delighted that Bush had been defeated, because not he was the person they they felt had betrayed them. They wanted everything. They wanted the good old days of Reagan to come back. So they were really happy that Bush had been defeated. And it's a little like Republican establishment types who were so happy that Trump had been defeated in 2020. And then, but they began to plan for their return to power during the 1990s, during the Clinton years. And so the most important thing that was on their agenda was the removal of Saddam Hussein. And it was I didn't take it that seriously, because it always seemed like, well, okay, why go on about Saddam Hussein, because he was kind of yesterday's news. He'd been defeated in the first Gulf War, and he was under heavy sanctions, United Nations Security Council sanctions. And he was subjected to constant inspections throughout the 90s. He was under this constant weapons inspection. So sanctions, weapons inspection. He was a diminished force. He really did, it just always seems so ridiculous. Well, why you keep going on about Saddam Hussein? I mean, he's gone. He's over. His time had come and gone. But no, they were absolutely determined, to just zero in on him. And of course, then they got their opportunity during the Bush younger term. Now, Bush younger had decided, obviously, that his father's failure to remove Saddam Hussein had contributed to his father's failure to secure re-election in 1992. I mean, he did not want to lose out to the neocons. I think he was kind of intimidated by the neocons, and so the neocons kind of wandered back in. This was their heyday, really. They were now in a much more important position than they were during the Reagan years. And Cheney, who had now returned with Bush as vice president, was I think had evidently also decided that it was a huge mistake to have left Saddam Hussein in power, and so that moment came to remove Saddam Hussein, something they'd been planning on throughout the 90s. For after the 9/11 attacks. So the reason I'm sort of bringing all this up is that Cheney initially had not thought about we're going to remaking the Middle East and regime change in Baghdad. He was a part of George H.W. Bush's team. He was the defense secretary, and he went along with the very limited objectives, simply get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And that was also part of the famous Powell Doctrine, which again sort of suggested, you got to limit your goals. You don't want to go, doing big things that we did in Vietnam. We don't want to do any of that. Set ourselves very limited goal, use overwhelming force quickly to secure limited goals, and then get the hell out. That was the Powell Doctrine. And Cheney, Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during the Cheney era when he was defense secretary. And Cheney went along. Yeah, we absolutely support the Powell Doctrine. And they said, yeah, that's exactly what we did. We applied the Powell Doctrine in Iraq. We used overwhelming force. We thumped Iraq, but it was for a limited end. We didn't do any nation building. We didn't do occupation of Iraq or anything like that. We just boom, boom, and then it was over. And that was the view. Um, uh, Sorry, I just saw somebody write, George, please don't put a somber black and white picture like that on your thumbnail. I thought you were dead. Scared me. Really? I look dead? I thought it was kind of nice. I thought it was a very nice picture. But okay. Um, I didn't know I looked dead. Um, but um, but I don't know. I've always liked black and white pictures more than color pictures. I don't know. I always thought they're always much prettier and much more expressive than color pictures. Um, so that was changing. Now, all the rest, how they went about uh, in the Bush younger administration. That's everyone knows all about the attack on invasion of Afghanistan, and then the invasion of Iraq, and the introduction of the kind of national security state, and Guantanamo, and all the rest. Now, I have to say, and I thought this at the time, that whoever was president at the time of 9/11 would have probably done almost exactly the same things that George George Bush did, because this is the United States. The United States, we're not going to just sit and take this kind of a terrorist attack. We're going to thump somebody. Somebody or other is going to get thumped. So there was the people who didn't like Bush, the people who kind of lefty liberal types, Democrats, who I think initially supported, well, at least they supported the Afghanistan invasion, but also to a large extent supported the Iraq invasion. Look, but most of the Democrats supported the Iraq invasion, but they kind of turned against it when the Iraq invasion started to go south. But then they started reviving the idea that somehow, well, it wouldn't have happened had Al Gore won the 2000 election, because if you recall that the 2000 election was intensely disputed, and it went on and on really through November, for 2 months, through going through the courts, until finally the Supreme Court ruled that the counting in Florida had to stop. And then finally, really, it was in January, it was decided that Bush had defeated Gore. Now, the idea that Al Gore would have pursued a different policy from Bush always seemed to be not based on any evidence. Al Gore was as hawkish and as ferociously interventionist as anything as Bush was. And if you recall, in the 2000 election, Bush had advocated a more humble foreign policy. I mean, we have to take all these kind of statements, as baloney. I mean, whenever they say, "Oh, I want a humble policy. I don't want to do nation building. No, no, nation building. No, no, I don't want to do anything like that. No, no, no." It's just like when Marco Rubio in the early days of the Trump administration. Well, it's a multipolar world. We're not going to be telling other countries what to do. We're not going to be interfering in other countries' elections. It's just we're just one power among many in the world. So these are they always say these kinds of things. However, Al Gore was very hawkish. He was very hawkish always. Going back to the 1980s when he was the kind of the new face of the post George McGovern Democratic Party. So the Democrats had kind of been reeling since that 1972 defeat of George McGovern, and though they got Jimmy Carter was a kind of a centrist, but they retained this fear that some George McGovern-like figure will once again emerge within the Democratic Party and then lead the party to another 49 state walloping. And they kind of interpreted Walter Mondale, though he was a centrist, he was never a McGovernite. They said, hey, this Mondale, he got a 49 state walloping, and so we really need Democrats who are really hawkish. They who are just as hawkish as the Republicans are. And Al Gore was very much in that mold. And so when he first emerged in the 80s, what everyone knew about Al Gore is, boy, this guy is a real foreign policy hawk. I mean, and he was a rising star very early within the party. His father had, of course, been a senator, so he had a head start. But he also had served in Vietnam, admittedly not in combat. He'd been a journalist, but nonetheless, he did serve in Vietnam. And so Gore was hailed as the new face of the new Democratic Party, as was Bill Bradley. Is that his name? Yeah, Bradley. I thought that's such a name from the past. He was the senator from New Jersey, a former Knicks player, but also very hawkish. So this was the new Democratic Party, and Gore was, of course, during the 90s, was an intense proponent of bombing Yugoslavia. That was his thing. He was, in the administration, he was the most hawkish on bombing the Serbs. And then as it went into the 2000 election, he had hired as his chief foreign policy advisor was Kenneth Pollock, and Kenneth Pollock had written a book, big book about Iraq. The need to deal with Iraq. Iraq is an existential threat to humanity. So this book came out, I think, about 1999. So this is, very much, as the drumbeat for the Iraq War was getting louder and louder in the United States during the 90s. During the 90s, long before the 9/11 attacks. So that was Al Gore. So I don't think anybody else would have been taking the steps that were any different from the ones that Bush and Cheney took in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. I think that pretty much anybody would have gone after Saddam Hussein. Why? Because it was easy. I mean, they knew perfectly well that by 2001, Iraq really, there was just nothing left of Iraq. I mean, it had been defeated in 1991. They had the sanctions that had gone on for 10 years. um, and it was just going to be a piece of cake. And then and the defeat of Saddam Hussein was a piece of cake. The Iraqi army was easily defeated when the United States invaded. Then, of course, it became very much more difficult, because then you had to actually run the country. And as always, the Americans hadn't really thought about, well, how are we going to actually run Iraq. But in terms of achieving a military victory, that was an easy thing, and they knew it was going to be easy, and so that was done. They knew the Iraqi army would just run away. Um, so I think, when there were these votes in Congress to support the Bush policy, you know they were overwhelmingly in support. I mean, the Senate voted to support Bush's war on Iraq. I mean, it was there. They voted. They had a chance to reject it, and they knew perfectly well what they were doing when they had the vote in the Senate. They were authorizing Bush to use force against Iraq. They were authorizing Bush's invasion of Iraq. So the Democrats voted for it, and of course, including Hillary Clinton, who subscribed to all of Dick Cheney's ludicrous claims, the argument that somehow Bush that Saddam Hussein was working with Al Qaeda. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and I think even that Saddam Hussein had some connection with the 9/11 attacks. So that was, so essentially there was pretty much a consensus going into that invasion. So it's it's obviously there's a vested interest in the media to make somehow Dick Cheney as this um, ghoulish, Machiavellian, malevolent uh, manipulator of the public, determined to invade Iraq, and ruthlessly pursuing this agenda of his. So I said I don't think that was the case. I think it was among the policy-making elites, they made their decision to go after Iraq very early, already quite early in 2002. You knew that this was going to happen. I mean, there was just nothing was going to stop it. I mean, there were the plans that was already being made in 2002 for this invasion, and but the rationale, they kept moving towards what's the rationale, and and I think Paul Wolfowitz, against one of the neocons who had who had worked for he's one of the original neocons. He had worked for Scoop Jackson. Then they moved him into the Reagan administration, and then he was he had a position in the George H.W. Bush administration. But he worked in the State Department. He was head of the policy planning staff. So it was, but he didn't have that much influence with Bush. But Wolfowitz did have a lot of influence when he returned with Bush the younger, but Wolfowitz had said, well, the reason we settled on the rationale for the invasion of Iraq was the weapons of mass destruction. The reason we settled on that was, well, that's the way we could get everybody on board. If we said we're going into Iraq in order to restore democracy, or kind of bring in democracy, we wouldn't have had any support for it. and so we had to sort of look around for a reason. And so we came up with this idea of the weapons of mass destruction. But they were very cunning about it, because when you say weapons of mass destruction, people think of obviously nuclear weapons. And they played on that deliberately. They remember the Condoleezza Rice talking about the mushroom clouds and everything else, because people assume, oh, weapons of mass destruction, that means nuclear weapons. And that's the one that people visceral fear of. But of course, weapons of mass destruction can mean almost anything. I mean, if you're using uh, chlorine as a kind of poison gas, they say, well, that's a weapon of mass destruction. And that was the thing. You say, well, you could say, well, it was we had weapons of mass destruction. So if we find in Iraq, some chlorine containers, used basically as disinfectant, and we find some chlorine containers, so well, that's it. We found weapons of mass destruction. We had the rationale. We were right to say Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, but they presented it in this way that to suggest that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, and that's why the thing about the mushroom clouds. So and Cheney, of course, played a very devious role in all of that, because he had uh, provided, he had leaked also information to select journalists who would then write up their stories on the basis of these leaks from Cheney. And then Cheney would go on television and cite these stories as if this was evidence of Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. Of course, their favorite source there was Jeffrey Goldberg, who's now who was then he was at the New Yorker, but then he was at the no, so he was then at the New Yorker, and now he's the editor in chief of the Atlantic. And but that was that was the way they played it. They leaked the stuff to the select journalists, and then they would say, "Hey, look, this is independent corroboration of what we're saying about Saddam Hussein," and and Cheney did that very effectively. Um, what was interesting, though, is as public opinion turned on the Iraq caper, um, his boss, George W. Bush, began to, he began to have doubts about the whole thing. He began to think in terms of getting the hell out of the whole, to the best way possible, just getting out of it. So he kind of began distancing himself, obviously not very successfully, from the Iraq debacle. Cheney never did that. Cheney continued to defend the invasion of Iraq, the claim that there was an Iraq Al Qaeda connection, the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, the claim that he was right to seize people anywhere in the world and dump them in Guantanamo, claim that the introduction of a surveillance state in the United States was really great and really successful. So he continued defending everything that the Bush administration did, while Bush himself seemed to sort of become very disillusioned with the whole thing. And I think it's significant that after 2008, when 2009, when Bush left office, he kind of more or less disappeared. You didn't see much of him. He really didn't do too many interviews. He didn't weigh in on public affairs. Cheney took a very different line. I mean, Cheney um, talked and talked and talked. I mean, he was always um, popping up, doing interviews, and and denouncing Obama. That somehow Obama was selling out America. The thought, Obama was, you know, a pusillanimous Chamberlain-like figure. And so that was the change. And it continued, and of course, when Trump emerged in 2015 and began criticizing, was something as unthinkable that a Republican would begin criticizing the Bush Cheney policy. Cheney really began taking issues with Trump and became increasingly nasty towards Trump, and he continued. What's interesting that he continued doing that, even though it was Trump who had pardoned Cheney's chief of staff, Louis Libby. Now, you have to be of a certain of an earlier generation to remember who the hell Louis Libby was. And it is one of those scandals that kind of consumes Washington. And then when you look back on it just a few years later, you simply cannot, for the life of you, remember what the hell that issue was about. But roughly, uh, that Bush, I think in 2002, was seeking to find the evidence that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction. And this guy called, I think Joseph Wilson, I think is his name, he was sent on a mission to Africa to prove that Saddam Hussein had been trying to buy yellow cake, which can be used for uranium, from Niger. And he didn't find any evidence, but Bush, I think in his inaugural, not his, in his State of the Union address in 2003, had brought up this issue of the yellow cake, but he had ascribed this to our British friends. These are very crafty people. He didn't say exactly that, oh yes, Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction because he'd been purchasing yellow cake. He said, well, our British friends tell us that Saddam Hussein has been trying to buy yellow cake from Niger. But originally he had tried to prove, to find evidence that Saddam Hussein had indeed been doing that. Anyway, he sent this guy, Wilson, and then Wilson, I think in the summer of 2003, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, "Hey, I never found bloody anything. I went on this mission, and I didn't find anything." And obviously, Bush and Cheney were a little upset about this. That this person who was supposed to work for the government had written this op-ed in the New York Times. And somebody within the administration went to Robert Novak. I don't know if people remember Robert Novak, who was this very conservative journalist whose basic creed on what he'd been doing for decades was, he acted as a as a sounding board for his um, well placed political sources. So they would leak all sorts of stuff to Robert Novak. They're all people within the Republican Party, and he would just write it all down for them. He was essentially kind of a bulletin board for what important Republicans wanted to get out. But anyway, somebody told Robert Novak that that trip by Joseph Wilson to Africa was some kind of a boondoggle organized by his wife, Valerie Plame, who was working for the CIA. I'm not quite sure what that was supposed to prove exactly, what the CIA, because the CIA had supported they had to support, they worked for the government, and particularly the CIA director, George Tenet, had said to Bush, "This is going to be a slam dunk. We'll absolutely find evidence uh, of weapons of mass destruction when we enter Iraq." So there was never really an issue that the CIA, opposed the administration policy. But anyway, Novak wrote this to suggest that Wilson, basically wasn't a serious person. This whole thing, he hadn't been. I think he hadn't really been sent by the administration to dig up information about Saddam Hussein. This was just a nice favor done for him by his wife, who was in the CIA, Valerie Plame. Um, the irony of it all, of course, was that Novak himself had been very much opposed to the invasion of Iraq. Novak had been attacked by the disgusting, revolting, vile, foul creature called David Frum, who in 2002, I think he wrote that article, either 2002, 2003, he wrote that article in National Review, the unpatriotic conservatives, because he said these conservatives, these leading conservative figures, were unpatriotic because they opposed the invasion of Iraq. And of course, among the unpatriotic conservatives was Robert Novak and of course Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan took pride of place. It was Buchanan and Robert Novak. And so Novak was never really, he was certainly no friend of the administration, at least as far as the invasion of Iraq was concerned. I mean, so on other things he was a friend of the administration. So it came, and apparently, who'd have thunk that somehow revealing the identity of somebody who's working for the CIA is a crime. And so they began a criminal investigation, and so the suspicion was that somebody from Dick Cheney's office had leaked the identity of Valerie Plame. So they came to this Scooter Libby, and because he was Cheney's chief of staff, and so he had to go before a grand jury, as to was he the leaker, and obviously Libby had denied that he was the leaker, but he also said that he knew that Plame had been working for the CIA, and he claimed that a journalist had told him. So, who told you? Because what they wanted was that, Dick Cheney, my boss, told me that she was working for the CIA. So, well, no, I mean, I heard it from a journalist. And then he said, well, who was the journalist? And he then named Tim Russert. Then he was still alive at that time. So he claimed Tim Russert had told him Valerie Plame, but then Tim Russert said, no, I never told him that. So anyway, so they indicted um, Scooter Libby. They said, "Oh, he was lying to the grand jury," and then he was convicted for lying to the grand jury, so perjury, and he was sentenced, I think, for 2.5 years in prison. Got a whacking great fine, $250,000. Um, but the irony of it all was that they never convicted him. They never put him on trial for the act that is supposedly the crime, which is to reveal the identity of a CIA agent. And so we still really, all this went on for a long time. This went on and on and on. And of course, Robert Novak, he said, I'm not going to tell you who told me that she was working for the CIA. And nothing really ever happened to Novak, which was always odd. You thought, well, okay, well, you're supposed to reveal your sources, and if you don't, you go to prison. I mean, this is what happened to Judith Miller. Anyway, no, but somehow there was never any question of Novak going to prison. Um, but anyway, he was then Libby was kind of facing this prison term and a big fine, and then Dick Cheney went and campaigned for him with his boss Bush. You got to pardon him, and Bush didn't really want to pardon him. He felt, well, basically, he shouldn't have lied to the grand jury, and he also didn't like the whole episode of leaking this information about the identity of the CIA agent. And one gets the impression and that Bush suspected that Scooter Libby did do it, and he did it at the behest of Dick Cheney. I think Bush did believe that. Now, the guy who went after Scooter Libby, this Patrick Fitzgerald, I think that was his name. Sometimes I say Patrick Fitzgerald, but sometimes I say Gerald Fitzpatrick. I think it's Patrick Fitzgerald. He was one of these awful, ambitious kind of U.S. attorneys who wanted to get Cheney, and I think Cheney, would put in and said, "Hey, my man Libby is just being persecuted by this ambitious Democrat in Illinois, this U.S. attorney in Illinois, and he just wants to get at me." But this didn't really cut too much ice with Bush, and so Bush commuted the prison sentence, so he didn't have to go to prison. He didn't commute the fine; he still had to pay the fine, but he didn't pardon him, despite the fact that Cheney kept pressing and pressing for a pardon. He wouldn't pardon Libby. And that, I think, contributed to the estrangement that took place between Bush and Cheney in subsequent years. But anyway, Trump, for some reason, and I don't know why, I think in 2018, decided to pardon Scooter Libby, to do what George W. Bush had been reluctant to do. So he pardoned Libby. Cheney wasn't in any way grateful for this. That didn't warm Cheney's attitude towards Trump in any way. He continued hating on Trump, and then, of course, once there was a real serious estrangement between Liz Cheney, his daughter, and Trump, then Dick Cheney really went after Trump. Just he's ranting and raving and attacking Trump, and then, of course, as Liz Cheney was now facing a serious challenge in Wyoming. I mean, Wyoming. I mean, Wyoming is it only has one congressman, and that congressman was Dick Cheney, and then whoever took over from him. But Liz became the one congressman from Wyoming. Of course, she got it because her dad owns Wyoming, and but after she attacked Trump, after she voted to impeach Trump, and then after serving on that January the 6th committee, that sham committee that was set up by Nancy Pelosi, she was going to have a real hard time um, securing the nomination of her party. And was going to have a really hard time winning in Wyoming. And of course, she was enormous, huge defeat for her, total humiliation. But her dad, Dick, had campaigned very actively for her, and put out all sorts of messages about what a terrible person Trump was, and so on. So no gratitude at all for at least doing what he had been berating Bush for not doing, namely pardoning Scooter Libby. So anyway, that's Cheney. I mean, I think in conclusion, I don't think he ever really had any particularly strong views. I think he's always had a sense of power, where power is, how do you get it, how do you keep it? That's important. Always, how do you keep it? And that how you then translate power into money, because Cheney then became a very, very wealthy man. I mean, he came, was from modest means, not a particularly outstanding academic record, or not a particularly outstanding anything. But somehow he had kind of wormed his way in with the Ford administration. So he was, that Ford had appointed Donald Rumsfeld as his chief of staff, and then Rumsfeld, for some reason, really liked Dick Cheney. So when Rumsfeld became chief of staff, Cheney became deputy chief of staff, and then when Ford appointed Rumsfeld as defense secretary, then Cheney moved up and to be chief of staff at a very young age. And you think this is, I think he was the youngest chief of staff ever. So you'd have to think that he knew how to make himself appealing and useful to important people. So it was, Gerald Ford, the president, had to have been very happy with what Cheney was doing, and that's really who he was. I mean, he was just a very effective administrator and very effective communicator. He wasn't in any way threatening. He wasn't in any way aggressive, abrasive. Someone people would dislike in the way that Rumsfeld was kind of aggressive and abrasive. People didn't like him very much. Cheney wasn't like that. It was always just very smooth, always very calm, very collected, and that works very well for you in Washington. Also, he had this knack of not appearing to be too ambitious. Everyone in Washington is very ambitious. So therefore, you have to hide it. You have to, otherwise, people will see how ambitious you are. Everyone hates you. Like Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is the problem with him is that he's so ambitious that everyone's guard is up against him. Cheney was just not ambitious. Nobody ever thought Cheney had any ambitions to be president. He was just, there's just always useful to whoever is his boss. Um, anyway, so that's Cheney. Um, and the thing is, as I say, I met him that one time at that dinner, and what struck me then, and always struck me about Cheney, is his odd way of speaking. He always twisted his mouth, so it was like talking out of the side. So I can't quite do it, but he was always speaking out of the side. Out of the side of his mouth. I guess it gave him a certain um, air of authority by doing that. Anyway, so that's Cheney. Now, I said I'd say something about the elections, and the. I guess Mamdani will probably pull it off, even though I think probably the race has been tightening. It's almost inevitable it's going to tighten in the last few days. And Trump has, of course, come out with an endorsement of Cuomo, though I don't know whether in New York that helps or hinders you that you've got the endorsement of Trump. Um, but what, what is interesting is what Michael Tracy has been doing in during the last few days, which was he kind of dug up the whole issue of the ouster of Andrew Cuomo, which again, all these things they happen and then you forget about it. And what was done to Andrew Cuomo was really quite outrageous. This was in 2020, 2021. And Cuomo is a disgusting creature in every possible way. And of course, remember what he did with COVID. And he was, of course, planning on riding out COVID to secure the Democratic nomination in 2020. But then, all these women kind of colluded to get him out. And this was fundamentally very undemocratic because even though Cuomo had been governor for a number of terms, he'd already had 3 terms as governor, and of course his dad had also been a 3-term governor. So people were already tired of him. But fundamentally, he owned the New York Democratic Party. There was no way you could challenge him for the in the primaries. So they came up with a very cute idea of how to get Andrew Cuomo out, exploit the whole Me Too hysteria. Remember, this is 2019, 2020, 2021. This is the era of the Me Too. And they tried to suggest that somehow Andrew Cuomo had been a sexual harasser. He had been helping himself to his staff and all this nonsense. You put this out there. I mean, this was the hysteria was so intense at that time that the people believe it. Oh yeah, he was, of course, all these young pretty girls working for him, and you help yourself. That's obviously the attitude. But none of that was true, and none of the women actually ever made the claim that he'd been engaged in any kind of sexual harassment. And so it was all completely nonsensical. But what happens is with all these types of cases is that it has a snowball effect. One woman makes some ridiculous allegation, another woman comes along, another allegation, and then you have a snowballing effect because you have all these opportunist lawyers. They start finding all these women. And suddenly, whoa, 12 women have come forward claiming that the sexual harassment. And of course, when you actually look at what these women are alleging, no one is alleging sexual harassment. There's absolutely no one is alleging sexual harassment. I mean, Michael Tracy talked about this case of this woman who said that what she felt, um, I think felt sort of sexually intimidated, or what I don't come exact word, because he had a box of cigars. Andrew Cuomo had a box of cigars on his desk, and think, well, how does a why would you be intimidated sexually because of a box of cigars on his desk? Well, because he would point out and say, "You see that box of cigars? That was a box of cigars that I got from Bill Clinton." Now, you say, "Well, okay, you got. How does that have anything to do with sexual intimidation?" Well, if you're Bill Clinton and cigars, Monica Lewinsky, then it all hangs together. He was obviously, when Andrew Cuomo said a box of cigars, he was of course referring to the whole issue with Monica Lewinsky, and that was it. So it really was at that level. I mean, it was nothing, no evidence whatsoever that there was any sexual harassment that Cuomo had committed. And then, of course, there was a report. Cuomo foolishly had asked, "Okay, well, I'm under all this attack. I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to have done." And so he asks the attorney general, "Well, investigate and then, see what you find." And then, he said, "Well, since I haven't done anything," he assumed the attorney general would say, "Well, there's no case here." Well, this is where Cuomo made a huge mistake, actually a fatal mistake, because that attorney general was Tish James, Big Tish, the Big Tish who tried to then bankrupt Trump a few years later. And now Big Tish had her own ambitions to be governor of New York, and so she saw this as an opportunity to do in Trump. I'm not Trump, do in Cuomo. And so she wrote, again, a ridiculous report, sort of suggesting that somehow, Cuomo had engaged in sexually inappropriate behavior, even though there was no evidence of any of that. And then what always happens when you publish a report like that, suddenly all your political allies start deserting you, and then suddenly you don't have any support, and then Cuomo stepped aside. It was a coup. It was an absolute coup. They couldn't defeat Cuomo electorally. He owned the Democratic Party machine, but basically they got him out, and they got this woman. This completely ridiculous woman is now the governor of New York. She hasn't done anything to deserve that position, but Cuomo had to step aside. But one of the people who had been pushing against Cuomo had been a young Mamdani. He was only kind of an assemblyman in those days, so no one had ever heard of him. But he was one of the people who had moved against Cuomo. And then at this recent debate, he brought one of those women forward. He was supposed he in other words, he did try to do to Cuomo what when we remember what Trump did when he knew Hillary Clinton was going to go after him in 2016 over the Billy Bush tape, when he was talking about that, well, if you're a celebrity, you can basically grope women, grab them by the pussy and whatever. That was the tape that was released just, I think, 48 hours before the Trump's second debate with Hillary Clinton, and Trump knew she was going to go after him for that tape. And so Bannon came up with the ingenious idea of collecting all of the women who had accused Bill Clinton over the years, all the the woman who had been raped, Juanita Broderick, and then so there was a number of these women who had accused Clinton, and there they were in the audience, and then Bill Clinton was looking very uncomfortable when he saw all these women. and that kind of nullified the attack that came eventually inevitably came from Hillary Clinton. But Mandani tried to do something like that in the recent debate with Andrew Cuomo. Um, we're bringing this, by bringing this woman into the audience, but the the why this kind of blew up in Mamdani's face is that this woman had brought a a lawsuit. She had brought a lawsuit against Andrew Cuomo. Now, of course, when you bring a lawsuit, then there is this process of discovery, and then the Cuomo team had started investigating this woman, on her claims, and it turns out that she had pulled this stunt before, and making all sorts of allegations that never stood up, and so once this woman realized she wasn't going to get any money out of this, she said, "Well, I'm going to withdraw my suit, my lawsuit against Andrew Cuomo." And then Cuomo said, "No, you can't withdraw your lawsuit. We need to go to trial. Let's go to trial. I want to be vindicated." Um, and and but Mamdani had completely distorted what really happened, because it's made it sound as if, oh, Andrew Cuomo is going after this woman, um, whom he had sexually harassed, and now he's harassing her again. But that was not what happened. As I say, she brought the lawsuit. Then, when she realized that this is going to blow up in her face, because they're going to dig up or present in court the evidence that she's made a habit of making these wild allegations that she's not has not been able to substantiate. Once she realized that, she said, "Okay, I'm going to withdraw my suit. I'm not going to make any money, so I'm going to withdraw my suit." And then Andrew Cuomo said, "No, you can't withdraw your suit. We need to go to trial." And so basically, he just said, "No, you can't withdraw." And so Mamdani kind of basically had deliberately, and I think malevolently, distorted the reality of what had actually taken place. Cuomo was not in any way harassing her. He was just saying, I want to be exonerated in court. So let's go to trial. I want a full legal exoneration, rather than have these things just continually hanging over me, and I'll be accused. Now, I don't think this is going to make that much of a difference, but it hasn't done Mandani any good, because if it looks like he's a kind of a shameless opportunist, and doesn't play with clean hands. He's tried to use this case unfairly against Cuomo, and then try to then distort what really happened. So anyway, so now I would imagine Mamdani will probably pull it off, but probably by a smaller margin than we expect. I don't think Cuomo cares that much. I'm not sure he ever really wanted to do this. I think he was. Remember when he lost the primary, I think he kind of said, "Okay, well that's it. I'm gone." And then big all sorts of big shot Democrats moved in and told him, "No, no, you've got to stick with this. You've got to run as an independent." And I don't think his heart is really in it. It's kind of a step down for him. I mean, he'd been governor of a state. Now he's just going to be the mayor of the city. But it, he probably would have won if Curtis Sliwa had dropped out of the race. But Sliver didn't want to do that, and Sliver is one of these characters I've never understood. I mean, he's been in New York since forever, and I don't even know who or what exactly he is. I mean, he's just always somehow around. He's always this ubiquitous presence, wearing that beret and trying to secure safety in the streets, safety on the subways. I mean, it always seems kind of gimmicky. But you're not going to win in New York City. It's just there's no way that somebody like him is going to win in New York City. So it's totally pointless for him uh, to run. Um, so there's that, and then of course there's I think I don't know if Robert is with us. You've got the gubernatorial race in neighboring New Jersey, which is obviously it's a close one. Um, I probably think that Cheryl will pull it off because you have to believe that this is a Democrat year, and that the Democrats are probably going to just make a clean sweep of all the. I mean, they're obviously going to win in Virginia, and but New Jersey is at least competitive. Um, so it could go either way, but I have to think that if it's a Democrat year, then Cheryl will will pull it off. Um, I, I have a difficult. I don't quite get why why her name is Mikey. Why does she have a boy's name? But I guess maybe if Robert were here, he would explain why she's adopted this a boy's name. Anyway, let's take a look at our locals board, the people who are members of our community and who are always very concerned about the condition of the dogs and about whether they're getting properly rewarded, they're properly fed, watered, and so they very generously contribute to the tip jar. So I really appreciate all of our friends, all the members of our locals board, and so thank you. And first question, it's very nice, is from Danaki. Thank you, Danaki. Thank you for all of your postings. So Danaki says, Kedvesh George, will establishment plant Mamdani, whose fake veneer is already cracking, and below it you can start to see some acceptable Zionism meant to repair the democrat image post-Gaza genocide, prevail over scumbag establishment plant and the unpunished mass COVID killer extraordinaire Cuomo, to herd the gullible progressive idiots into the future 15-minute city of the Great Reset. Well, I think as I said, will he pull it off? I have to think that he's built up a substantial enough lead that it's going to be very difficult for Cuomo to overtake him. One thing that is interesting is that the awful, repugnant Mike Bloomberg, is now pouring quite a lot of money into the Cuomo campaign. You know, a few million. In the last days of the campaign, that can make a big difference to Cuomo. It doesn't make any difference to Bloomberg's bottom line. I mean, he's so rich that just this is really, it's not even pocket change. I mean, it's tip money. Um, and so that could help Cuomo. I don't think it's going to be enough to for him to win, but I agree that the that somehow Mamdani is now losing some of that veneer. I mean, as I was saying about the issue of the seizing on this opportunism, seizing on this in this very opportunistic way on that whole sexual harassment nonsense against Cuomo, and I think that blew up in his face. I think that may hurt him. The problem is that you talk about the nursing homes and everything that happened in COVID time. Um, and those are absolutely things that you need to go after Cuomo on. Um, but it's very difficult for somebody like Mamdani to do that because basically the Democratic Party establishment, of which he's a member, they all embraced all of the COVID restrictions, all of that nonsense, all of the mask wearing, all of the distancing, the vaccines. So that Mamdani is a part of that. So for him, and then of course the whole issue of why they dumped all of these COVID patients into the nursing homes and thereby wiped out all the elderly people. They can't really do that. They can't really, it's too much ingrained into their worldview. But that's where I think Cuomo is very vulnerable. I mean, that's why you should absolutely go after him on. You don't go after him on sexual harassment. I mean, the guy is not Jeffrey Epstein. He's not Harvey Weinstein. He's been in politics all of his life. He'd gone through Senate confirmation hearings. You remember he was housing Secretary of Housing to Bill Clinton. He'd run for governor. I mean, if there were any scandals with him, about with sexual harassment or whatever, we would have known about it. So this is just all made up, trying to make him out to be some, Harvey Weinstein like figure. So I think that's hurting Mamdani. I think he's if I were to wager, I think he's going to be a kind of a Bill de Blasio figure, but he probably is smoother than de Blasio. De Blasio just became very unpopular because he was just so arrogant, and Mamdani is not going to do that. But I don't think he's going to do very much, to be honest. I think, as I said last week, the mayors in New York are very constrained. The governors have a lot of power. The state legislature has a lot of power. There's not that much that a mayor can do. I mean, he can hire a kind of an awful kind of police commissioner, um, uh, but then he's going to have a problem because, of course, if law and order spirals out of control, he will be out very, very quickly. I mean, there's nothing that's going to mobilize voters against him as surely as a spike in crime. It's what people are most afraid of, and then led obviously to the rise of Mayor Giuliani. Yeah, I think I mean, he could try the route of setting up a state grocery store. I doubt whether it's going to work very well, but I mean, he could try. Uh, but he's going to have the same problem that De Blasio had, which is you do have to keep Wall Street happy. I mean, this is New York City's revenue base. I mean, this is how New York City makes money. I mean, it's the financial capital of the world. I mean, you got to keep these people happy. So you can't really pursue policies that will lead people to leave the city. You got to make sure that all the rich fat cats stay in New York. So it's going to be like De Blasio. A lot of big talk. Hey, I'm so lefty, but in the meantime, you're keeping Wall Street well fed and happy. So um, yeah, I mean, I think that he will be a De Blasio figure. I think what's interesting. Will he have a future after? I mean, if he gets reelected, then he may have a future after being mayor of New York. He's still a young man, and he could be the next Obama. If he fails to get reelected, then I think he has no political future. But most mayors, other than unless you're completely useless, like David Dinkins, most mayors get reelected. I mean, even you know Bloomberg. I mean, Bloomberg was reelected twice. De Blasio was reelected. So, um, I mean, but Eric Adams did not get reelected. I mean, he was just completely useless. I would imagine Mamdani is more intelligent and he's not going to make the mistakes that Eric Adams made. Um, and then Denaki goes on. He says, and good riddance to that despicable war pig Cheney, as fun loving criminals sang in the song, but I'm not a dick like Cheney. Okay, that's very good. Um, and then, so thank you, Denaki. And then Summer Petrus, welcome. Always good to see you. We met recently in Budapest. And so Samba Petra says, George, for your consideration, comment. Belgium claims that its sovereignty could be undermined legally and financially if the EU goes ahead and seizes Russian state assets held in Belgium under Euroclear. So can it invoke the Treaty of London that guarantees its sovereignty, or have NATO treaties countermanded this legacy treaty? Well, that's a very good question. I mean, they're applying a great deal of pressure on Belgium, um, and they figure that they can intimidate Belgium in a way that they have so far failed to intimidate Hungary. So they're going to keep going on and on at Belgium that he should agree to the theft of these Russian sovereign assets. So far, Belgium has said no, because basically we're going to be on the hook. You steal 140 billion euros. That's the number, but it's probably a bigger sum than that. You steal 140 billion euros, then we Belgians are going to be on the hook. We're going to have to face Russians in court for decades to come. I mean, they're going to, because the Russians, whenever at some point they're going to come and say, we want our money back. It's our money. And if Belgium doesn't have the money, then essentially they'll be suing in one court after another, demanding that Belgium gives back this money. And it's going to be Belgium, because it'll be Belgium that's will have to have courts ruling against it, because there's no way that any court can support the theft of sovereign assets. I mean, it's so obviously a violation of international law. I mean, I talked about it in a recent podcast about here's the United Nations Convention on sovereign assets. It's just unambiguous. You cannot touch them. So obviously Belgium would lose in these cases. And during this litigation, which, as I say, could go on for years, Belgium's reputation is going to be extremely damaging. So either that, or Belgium decides that they're going to pay up the money. But Belgium can't just get its hands on 140 billion euros just like that, or here's the money, because that money will be gone. I mean, the whole point of this is that this 140 billion will be used as collateral for loans to Ukraine. Well, of course, Ukraine is under no obligation to repay these loans, and Ukraine's not going to have any money to repay the loans. So therefore, the collateral will be gone. So now Belgium says, "Oh yeah, but we, the risk has to be shared by other EU member states." And then Ursula von der Leyen says, "Yes, of course, we'll all share the risk. Don't worry, don't you're not going to be alone, on the hook for this money." But of course, Belgium knows, well, no one's going to cough up any money. I mean, I mean, are you serious? You're going to go other countries? They have their own economic problems. They're gonna say, hey, that's Belgium's problem. Um, so Belgium absolutely doesn't believe these pledges that other countries are, that the risk is going to be shared by other EU member states. Um, so the question then is, will Belgium hold out? Um, I have my doubts. I actually think that the EU will eventually get its way, and that Belgium will succumb. I mean, they're very upset now. They said no at the recent EU meeting. There's going to be another big EU meeting in December. Um, so I think they're going to have difficulties holding out in the face of all this pressure. But it's a terrible humiliation, to go through this, because Belgium is making perfectly reasonable claims, because because basically they all know this is illegal. I mean, there's no argument about it. Belgium knows this is illegal. So this is theft, and if it's like you're going to be answerable for theft, and what are you going to do? What's your defense going to be when you get caught? Because you're obviously going to get caught. You steal 140 billion euros, you're going to get caught. What's your defense? You don't really have a defense. So they know it's illegal, and that's why they're trying to worm their way out of it. But Ursula, I think, isn't going to allow this. So I think that they probably are going to do it. They have to, because they don't have the money. They're just looking around for this Ukraine project. They want to keep it going for another 2-3 years, but they don't have the money to keep it going for another 2-3 years. So where are they going to find the money? It's like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's steal this Russian money. So anyway, thank you so much. And then thank you, Sava Petros. Really appreciate that. And his Vic Shakapopoulos says, "Dear George, on a live stream last week, I claimed that the Western soft power has diminished and that it could in the future give birth to the multipolarity." Yeah, you said that last week, yeah. "I agree that we are very far away from that moment and that the Atlantic Empire still dominates the world politically, economically, and militarily. Its grip on the world is arguably stronger than ever." I think that's right. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but you have to be realistic, because when there was a kind of multipolarity, it was in the during the Cold War, because there was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was not only politically and militarily very powerful. Economically, it wasn't so powerful, but politically and militarily powerful. But above all, it had an influence in the world. It had an influence that challenged that of the United States, because the Soviet Union could present, hey, we've got a model of political and economic development that's different from the United States model. We have this state-managed industrialization, state-managed modernization, and this is very different from the robber baron capitalism, as the Soviets presented it, robber baron capitalism, free market capitalism advocated by the West. And so that had an influence in the non-Western world. They thought, yeah, this is pretty good. I mean, they didn't particularly want Stalinism or anything like that, but I thought, state managed industrialization was a rather attractive model. So much so that the kind of leading kind of public intellectual of sort of the late 1950s, Walt Rostow, who then got a job in the Kennedy and Johnson administration. So Rostow, wrote that book, The Stages of Economic Growth. But the reason he wrote that book was that he thought, well, the Soviet Union is posing a very serious challenge for us. We need our own ideology. We need our own model of economic development that is going to be appealing to the non-Western world. So Rostow wrote that book, The Stages of Economic Growth, as so in fact America felt that it needed an ideology to rival that of the Soviet Union. And the Kennedy administration, when it came to power in 1961, they said we need an ideology to rival the Soviets. There's wars of national liberation. He said, well, they advocate wars of national liberation. We need something to counter that. So if you want multipolarity, now of course that was bipolarity, but that was multipolarity. You had a different system of government, a different economic system, but that was also influential in the world. But you don't have that anymore. You have China. China is it's an economic power, a major economic power, but it's not a rival of the United States. Also, I don't think China really inspires any great admiration. It's not like it has an specific economic model that that others want to emulate, because essentially, China is a place where people invest. It's a kind of a workshop. The big corporations, mostly Western corporations, set up factories in China, and that the big Chinese economic development arises because the big Western corporations set up factories there. That's the Chinese economic development. Apple, BMW, they set up factories there in China, and that's all part of this big Chinese economic growth. So there's nothing really, it's like this whole thing with the rare earths. Now, China has indeed been quite clever, in fact, very clever, that they've built up this monopoly on rare earths, even though there's nothing rare about rare earths. I mean, they're all over the world. There's nothing, special about them. But China, I think, but manufactures about 90% of the rare earths, and then 80% does responsible 80% of the refining, whatever. But the reason they do it is that the mining and refinement of rare earths is very damaging to the environment. And in the Western countries, they don't really want to do these things. It's very unpopular doing it. This because people don't want to damage their environment so much. So, well, if the Chinese want to do it, let them do it. Now, the Chinese said, well, the Chinese don't care too much about the what they do to the environment. So I say, yeah, fine, we'll do it. Now, of course, the West has realized that this is a serious issue, that they've neglected the mining and refinement of rare earths, and the West is now, especially the United States, are going to get in the business of the rare earths. But what I mean is that people don't admire that. It's not like you've got somehow, well, this is soft power, or somehow people think this is really this is fantastic that they've something that they've done. It's just, well, they did it because they don't care about the environment that much. So that's why, as I say, I don't see the great multipolarity, and particularly when it comes to Russia, which is its influence is declining. You just have to accept it. The influence is declining. Its influence in the Caucasus is declining, with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Its influence in the Middle East has been declining steadily. It's being pushed out in Europe. I mean, it only has this two countries that are in any way well disposed towards Russia in Europe, or half a country. Serbia is obviously one of them, and then the half of Bosnia and Herzegovina that is run by the Serbs, Republika Srpska. Otherwise, it's just not there. So that's what I'm saying is that yeah, we'd love to see multipolarity. We'd love to see the Western influence challenged, and so. But you just have to be realistic. I mean, it just isn't happening. Because there's Gaza. I mean, this whole Gaza thing. This is a Trump plan. This is an American plan. It's not a Russian plan. It's not even a U.S. Russia plan. At least you can have. Well, let's have a U.S. Russia plan for Gaza. We don't have that. It's a U.S. plan. So, as I was saying earlier, in 1991 there was a U.S. Soviet conference on the Middle East. It would be inconceivable to have anything like that now. Anyway, Vic goes on. But what I meant was that its Gramscian cultural hegemony is weakened. Okay. The Western political and economical systems are no longer a model to pursue for most of the people around the world. Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. That it's not a model that is much admired, though. I don't know whether it's been a model that it's been admired for quite some time. Even during the Cold War, I don't know that anyone actually particularly admired the model. I mean, the only people who admired the kind of the United States during the Cold War were the Eastern Europeans, the ones who were actually living under Soviet rule. They did have a very affectionate, sentimental attachment to the West. And of course, the Russians themselves, under Soviet rule, they had a very idealized view of the West. I'm not sure countries in Africa and Asia, those who had been subjected to Western imperialism, particularly admired the West. On the other hand, you'd have to say though that, and I don't fully understand this, to be honest, but somehow the British have retained this Commonwealth, this association with its former imperial possessions. Now, probably it doesn't amount to anything very much. It's just a regular boondoggle, and they go meet one another at these Commonwealth summits, and the British royal family. They set a great store about the Commonwealth, and probably doesn't really amount to anything other than having these colorful events, state banquets, and it's very, very nice. The reason I bring that up is that Russia is having difficulties retaining at least some semblance of. I mean, they called it a Commonwealth of Independent States, but to make that in any way as a meaningful event, I don't really see it. I mean, it's like with among those Commonwealth of Independent States, I mean, a number of them, in other words, in terms of the former Soviet republics, another of them is like the Baltic states, Ukraine, are rabidly hostile to Russia, so that's gone. There are a number of them that are moving out of any kind of Russian orbit or influence, like Armenia and Azerbaijan. You got Georgia, kind of half and half, not particularly pro-Russian, but not exactly very, not they don't want to go down a path of war. And then you've got the stans, or the Kyrgyzstans, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistans, Turkmenistan. They're up for grabs with the West. We don't know which way that's going to go, but they're up for grabs. They're not really in the Russian column. So I would love to have at least something comparable to the Commonwealth. Everyone would at least show up in Moscow, and they would have a nice, colorful state banquet. We don't really have that. Anyway, to go on with Vic's comments, the Western political and economic system is no longer a model to pursue for most of the people around the world, and Western culture is not as appealing as it used to be. As I say, people like Viktor Orban, who was a kind of a young man in the 1980s. Yeah, he would love the West. Thatcher, Reagan, the Pope. Fantastic. These would be his heroes. They don't really. That's they don't really think that anymore. But nonetheless, like in Poland as well. Oh, Thatcher, great. We want Thatcher. Give us Thatcher. Um, but no one else did that. You did. I mean, people in Africa didn't think, "Well, God, we want Thatcher." Give me Reagan or give me death. I mean, it didn't happen. It's just this Eastern Europeans, these living under communism, idealize that kind of the Western model, and that's the you know capitalism, freedom, democracy. We want. Um, it's not as appealing as it used to be. Nobody cares about Hollywood anymore. Well, yeah, I think that's true, and I think no one cares about Hollywood even in the West. I think I think that's a good point. Yeah, that's in terminal. That's been going on for some time. A major terminal decline. Um, but I wonder. I mean, whether there's any cinema anywhere that people care about. Whether there's German cinema, French cinema, is Chinese cinema. I mean, people are really, I got to go see this Chinese movie. Um, so I don't know. It just may be that when it comes to cinema, that the moment of cinema has passed as a cultural phenomenon. I just don't think it's as important now as it once was. I mean, and that's been it's been a long time coming, but there was absolutely a time when cinema was very important, and that even cinema, in other countries, it wasn't just Hollywood, but you had Ingmar Bergman in Sweden, and then you had the Italians, all the Fellinis and Antonionis, and then even in Eastern Europe, they were making interesting films. I don't know that anyone's. There's just that was a long time ago. I don't know if anyone is today making films. Say, "Oh, I got to see this new Japanese wave." That's absolutely essential to see. So, I think cinema as a cultural phenomenon is something that's in the past. I think it's just it's never really coming back. It's because I think it's been a long-term decline, and so it affects Hollywood, but I think it affects everyone. Anyway, I also think most of the world's peoples don't believe in Western propaganda as strongly as they used to. Yeah, but again, I don't think they ever did believe. I don't. When we talked about Africa and Asia, what they used to call the third world, they never believed Western propaganda at all. I mean, there was always at the United Nations there was always a block, the block of what was called the third world, and that block usually voted with the Soviet Union, and that's why the United States became very, very hostile to the United Nations because they suddenly found that much of the United Nations would vote against the West. And they were well organized, very effectively organized by the Soviet Union, who used to use the United Nations very, very skillfully against the West. One after another, the UN General Assembly would pass resolutions that the Western powers, and by that I mean the United States, would absolutely hate. So, and that was always very well organized by the Soviet Union. So they passed these General Assembly resolutions like economic sanctions are a very bad thing because economic sanctions are a means of coercion by the rich, strong powers against the poor, weak powers, namely us, the third world powers. So, they would pass one after another of these types of resolutions that the Americans absolutely hated. And that was all done because the Soviet Union kind of organized this block of states in which they said, "Hey, we're supposed to have in the United Nations we have sovereign equality. We may be small and weak, but nonetheless we are a member state, the equal of any other member state." And that was uh, the reason. I mean, if you kind of remember what it was like in the 70s and 80s, there was absolute hatred, the absolute loathing for the United Nations, and this was fueled um, the movement of the neocons and and particularly the movement on the right in America, Reagan, and then Gene Kirkpatrick, who was the Reagan's permanent representative at the United Nations. They would attack the United Nations because the United States was constantly in a minority, was constantly getting outvoted by the rest of the world, who said, "Hey, I think there should be a more equitable distribution of the world's goods than that envisaged by the Western powers." So I don't think anyone ever really believed in Western propaganda. They did believe in Western power. They said, yeah, the West had real power at their disposal, and there's not much you can do about that. But in terms of Western propaganda, as I say, the only people who believed it were the people living in Eastern Europe, and I think also some of the Russians who naively kind of embraced Gorbachevism. Anyway, and then Vic goes on. I know at this point there's still no valid alternative power system that could compete with the hegemon, but the loss of Western prestige and respectability is visible. I absolutely agree with you. I think as I've made clear, I agree with you about that. Wouldn't it have geopolitical consequences at some point in the future, or it doesn't matter and can easily be reversed? Well, will it have a consequence in the future? I guess so. Depends on how far we're thinking, how far ahead we are thinking. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year. I think that's the problem that I've had with the Pepe Escobars of this world, that they're kind of saying, "Hey, the new kid on the block is China. China's now the dominant power in the world. Now they're the ones who are challenging the West. The West is now desperately trying to keep up. They're being defeated at every front by this China-led bloc. So no, that isn't happening. It's a fantasy world. You want something to be true, and therefore you declare it to be true. So I think that's my objection. Now, what will happen in the future, I don't know. I just don't think it helps to go around making these declarations that somehow China is now the leading power in the world. It isn't. So anyway, thank you for that very very thoughtful set of messages. And Cynthia, very good to see you, Cynthia. Cynthia, as I always say, is our resident cinema scholar, a scholar of films, as at the time when films mattered, when people watched films because they were important cultural phenomena. And so, Cynthia is an expert on that, and Cynthia allows us to enjoy the benefit of her expertise. So we run our film club of Monday nights at the movies screenings on Mondays, and we always have something good. It's always a good film, and so you can watch the film. It's on our locals board, so you can join our community. You get to watch this great movies, and most important, you get to enjoy Cynthia's very astute, knowledgeable judgment and commentary, and she provides amazing amount of information. So yesterday we had the Cracker thriller from the 1970s, the Day of the Jackal, and I've seen the film several times. And but I learned a great deal just from Cynthia's just amazing commentary. So it's okay. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't even notice that. But Cynthia just says, well, you notice this and you notice that, and so wow, all kinds of things that just I had just missed. Hey, I didn't realize there was this scene, and the significance of this scene, or the significance of this comment by this character in the film. And so a lot of things just fell into place, just thanks to Cynthia's commentary. So thank you very much, Cynthia. And so strongly urge everyone, go see The Day of the Jackal, after this. Enjoy it. It's a great film. And read Cynthia's commentary. You can't do worse. Anyway, Cynthia says there's more talk than proof as to the purpose and outcome of the two Black Hawk missions led by the GUR, that's the Ukrainian intelligence, into an active Russian kill zone near Pokrovsk. But since this back to back operation was so high risk that it amounted to a suicide mission, those being rescued were most likely top CIA MI6 officers trapped there. And since by law they're mercenaries, Russia's free to neutralize them without being charged with war crimes. They can't save their skin by surrendering to the Russians. Agree? No, I think that's right. That's a very interesting question. I mean, it's clear from everything that we've read that there are indeed mercenaries, and more than that, they're actually working for the the Western intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, in Ukraine. And so therefore um, they are indeed not regular forces in combat. Um, the Russians nonetheless, um, they do respect the various conventions of war. So they're not going to say, well, hey, they're not these people, these mercenaries with CIA, MI6. We're not just going to shoot them on sight, claim that they're terrorists. So they will still accord them prisoner of war status. You're absolutely right. They don't have to, but the Russians probably will. I mean, that's what they've done in the past. So I tend to think that that they will do it. My own feeling is that yeah, if they can get them, take them in captivity. The important thing is not to release them. My problem is that Russia then captures these Western mercenaries or intelligence operatives or whatever, and then they release them. That doesn't make any sense at all to me. You've got them, boom. They pay the price, and that they're going to be in captivity for some time, a year, 2 years. Even if there's some kind of a settlement in the war, it doesn't mean you're going to get released. You know, anytime soon. So. Uh, so yeah, I don't think they're going to neutralize them, um, and by just killing them, I think they will still accord them prisoner of war status. That's okay, but don't release them. So therefore, just basically keep everyone. I don't think anybody should be released. I mean, I don't think anybody should be released for as prisoners of war. I think that this nonsense of these prisoner of war exchanges has to stop. And I where I think Russia should do. I mean, I don't care too much about these characters. What I'd like to see much more of is, or indeed any of, which is start targeting territory outside of Ukraine, because that's the problem for Russia, which is that They're not they're not inspiring fear in the West, and that means that's only encouraging the West to up the ante and to take greater and greater risks in Russia. And I think that's a very dangerous situation, and and I think that's why I'd like to see the West suffering consequences for what it's doing, and I think that is means hitting targets outside of Ukraine. That I think is a much more effective way of doing it, other than just killing these CIA MI6 officers. I don't care about that. But it's also more effective than blustering about nuclear weapons. And as I said, talking about these nuclear missiles, we got this, the Oreshnik, the Burevestnik, they've got the new submarine launch missiles. Nobody is impressed. And Russia should really by now know nobody is impressed. And the reason nobody is impressed is that if you're not prepared to do little things, like hit targets in Polish territory, or hit targets in Romanian territory. Just simply, something that's being used for transporting lethal weapons to Ukraine to kill Russians. If you're not willing to do that, nobody believes you are going to launch an intercontinental missile and to hit the United States. I mean, it's just nobody believes that. Nobody believes you're going to resort to nuclear weapons. If you can't do the little things, no one's going to believe that you're ready to start a nuclear war. That's just So that's why all this talk of Oreshniks and Burevestniks, and I think it's all baloney. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. Really appreciate that, Marty. Marty has got this great picture here of Brennan. The interesting thing is that you would think this is a very expressive picture of Brennan. Is that this is um, uh, this is AI, and that this isn't genuine. It actually is genuine. That's exactly Brennan's face, and he's really getting very, very pissed off because he's sensing that he will be prosecuted. Just like it's clear that there will be superseding charges filed against Comey, and they're going to go after Brennan as well. And I think he's very pissed off. And I don't know. People saw this. I don't know, this interview he was giving, or before some audience, and somebody asked very good questions about Brennan, the distortions of the intelligence that Brennan had engaged in, contradicting the findings of his own intelligence people, and declaring that somehow Russia intervened in the 2016 election in order to help Donald Trump, which is something that no one within the intelligence world had actually determined. They did not think that Russia was intervening to help Donald Trump. They did think Russia was interfering. They accepted that, but not in order to help Donald Trump. So he was distorting the intelligence. Now, how you turn that into a crime, that's a different matter. But nonetheless, Brennan looks he was very angry when he gets confronted with that. I mean, I tend to think, hey, it's a crime against the United States. I mean, if they went after Trump, who as president, for challenging the election results, which is something that's legal, but they went ahead and said, well, he committed crimes against the United States. Well, Brennan committed crimes against the United States. So, but he looks a very odious character in that picture. So thank you so much, Marty. Thank you for all the hilarious postings that you give for us. And then Vic asks me, did you watch Carson's interview with Nick Fuentes? What's your opinion on him as his movement? I just never could figure out what the guy's about. He's just a troll, or does he have a real agenda? I did watch it, and it was kind of painful to watch because I just don't think very highly of Fuentes. I don't know. There's something about him. As soon as I listen to him, I just form a very low opinion of him. I don't know. It's like he's obviously quite a smart guy. I mean, well, yeah, very smart guy. Um, but I don't think he knows a great deal. I think he's been, he's grabbed onto ideas that other people have been articulating for years and years. I mean, the people who used to write for VDare, that anti-immigration white nationalist blog that went on for about 25 years. So, he Fuentes has taken over some of those things, but I have a feeling that he's grabbed onto this. I don't think he knows very much about these topics, but that's okay. He's still very young. Um, but the problem I have with him is that I don't think he is. He's very sincere. I don't think he's very sincere. I do think that he is a master grifter. He has found a way to be very successful. Found a way to be quite inflammatory. Um, but I'm not convinced that he really believes any of the things he says. And then you have to then think: is he a plant? Is he really working for the deep state? A way of essentially having this kind of magnet, all the people who are drawn towards him, that enables the deep state to keep an eye out on lots of people, like who are the people who are suddenly congregating around him. Um, there's something about this makes it very, very suspicious. Nothing happens to him. He shows up. He's there on January the 6th, getting filmed, making his usual inflammatory comments, yet he wasn't prosecuted for over January the 6th. And he wasn't prosecuted, given also what an influential figure he is. They didn't decided not to go after him. So I have to think that there's maybe, it's the whole thing is a kind of psyop, a kind of a deep state operation to keep tabs on all sorts of undesirables. So I don't know. The moment he speaks, I just think there's something very, very shady about him. I absolutely do not trust him at all. Even when you look at his face, I mean, do you really trust that person? So that was my feeling. But I mean, obviously, I'm not going to join all the Mark Levins and Ben Shapiro's and others piling onto Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, I do take seriously. I think he is genuine. I think he is a thoughtful person. I think he is a public intellectual, and I think he is sincere. I mean, he's changed his view on many things, but I think he's sincere. So he's a different case, but Fuentes, I don't know. He's someone I would just stay away from. I think he's bad news, and he serves, I think, to discredit um, the right. I think he serves to discredit it because he makes, I think, a lot of ridiculous statements and a lot of inflammatory statements, and I don't think that doesn't just help anybody. I think it's, I used to say that about David. Oh, I think he does useful work, but because he's insists on being so inflammatory, you're kind of discrediting your cause. You're discrediting the important and useful work that you could be doing. So that's my view. So anyway, I think that Fuentes is working for somebody else. I think it's in my view, it's a deep state operation. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? But that was my feeling. He just, I have a certain feeling about things. He just gives me the creeps, and I think this guy is not on the level. And Anne Marie, always very good to see you. Anne Marie is, of course, our musical scholar, expert, and more important, musical performer. Performs in the most distinguished orchestras in the world, and performs some of the most difficult pieces of music. She worked recently on the Ring Cycle. It was just an amazing feat to do with the Ring Cycle. So she performs these great musical works. She's worked with the some of the best conductors and composers and performers of the 20th and 21st centuries. And we're so fortunate here at the Gaggle. Don't know what we did to deserve it at the Gaggle to have her expertise and her insights at our disposal. And so she's always providing very interesting and very insightful observations about the music that we post here, and above all, observations based on personal experience, which is something extraordinary that she can describe music from the point of view of the performer. Somebody, well, this is a really difficult, challenging piece of music. This is what it felt like to play it. And I just find that quite amazing. Just reading somebody. Reading that from somebody who had to go through that. So we're very, very grateful for Anne Marie for all that she does and for all her, very, very profound commentary. And since our the latest offering on the Gaggle Music Club is the Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, I'm looking forward to Anne Marie, offering some insights on that, when she has time, because it's one of the great works of Western music. I'm sure Anne Marie has played it many times, and so I really like to know something about what it's like playing that very, very difficult piece of music. So anyway, Anne Marie, thank you so much. Thank you for all of your contributions. And Robert says comedian Will Ferrell did some of the best impressions of George W. Bush. Yeah, I remember that. He was very good. I was thinking today because of Dick Cheney. I don't know if, but I couldn't find it in the 2004 election. Saturday Night Live had a kind of a skit of the vice presidential debate, which was Dick Cheney and John Edwards, who's later kind of discredited. John Edwards, who was the um, John Kerry's running mate. And so they had the vice presidential debate. And so what the Democrats were trying to do was to continue to bring up the fact that Dick Cheney's daughter was a lesbian, because they thought, well, this will discredit Cheney with conservative Republican voters. So they were trying to bring the subject up as frequently as possible. And so the point about the skit was that whatever the question, John Edwards would immediately bring it back to Mary Cheney and said, well, the last thing I would want to do is to talk about Dick's daughter, who's a lesbian. I'm strongly opposed to anyone bringing up Mary Cheney's lesbian proclivities. So it went on and on. So all the time was this. In the sketch, you're always bringing up Mary Cheney. I tried to find it today on YouTube and I couldn't find it. So I'm thinking Marty, who's a kind of brilliant researcher, maybe he could find it, but I don't know. I doubt whether it's available. So, but anyway, but yeah, Will Ferrell. I'm not a huge fan of Will Ferrell, to be honest. In fact, I'm not a fan at all. In fact, I don't like him at all. But I did think that his impressions of George W. Bush were very good. They were among the best. So he kind of I mean, Saturday Night Live. The best ones were, I think, Phil Hartman, who used to do Ronald Reagan. Did a very good one of Ronald Reagan, but Hartman also did a very good one of Bill Clinton. So they were the best. But Will Ferrell as George W. Bush was very good. I just don't think Will Ferrell's particularly talented, and this way, I don't think these movies that he made after he left SNL, I don't think any of them are worth watching. Anyway, and then Robert says, as best I can tell, Cheryl was a tomboy type, athletic, competitive, and drawn to challenges. Okay, she went to the Naval Academy and thrived in the male-dominated settings, with interests often associated with boys. That probably explains the nickname Mikey. No, I absolutely think that that's probably the case. The interesting thing is that I think she's part of that class of Democrats who kind of emerged in the last 10 years. The national security Democrats. They're the ones who are worried about Russia. They're the ones worried about the Russian interference in our system. Um, the so they're national security. That's their big thing, because it's very much like the woman who is the running to be governor, and I think she's going to win. I think quite comfortably. God, not Asperger, but some name like the governor of Virginia, exactly the same type. I think she was also in the CIA and very much national security. That's her big thing, and and they of course all were ardent Russia gators. Trump is endangering America's national security. Trump is working for the Kremlin. Putin needs to be dealt with. So I think I know Mikey Sherrill and this governor of Virginia. They're very much the very similar types. And then Robert says, what segment of the U.S. electorate does Mark Levin imagine he can court by taking on Tucker Carlson? The traditional conservatives, pro-establishment Republicans, the newer populist anti-establishment right? Well, that's a very good question. I tend to think that what he's trying to do is to just destroy Tucker Carlson's reputation. I think he's trying to do to Tucker Carlson what was done to Pat Buchanan, back in 1992. You remember? I mean, Buchanan was really came under attack. You remember? I mean, Buchanan had been around for years and years, but suddenly, as he emerged as a major figure in the Republican right, there was an huge onslaught on him, claiming he was a Nazi, he was an anti-Semite, a Holocaust denier, and everything. And this did a lot of damage to Buchanan. He never really recovered from that. I mean, he ran again in '96 and 2000, but each time he did worse than he did in the previous election cycle. Down to the point in 2000, he just got a ridiculously small number of votes. So what Levin, I think, is doing is to get into people's minds that Tucker Carlson is a Nazi. He's an anti-Semite. He's a Holocaust denier. He's someone no respectable person would want to associate with. And I think it's just a way, I think, of just discrediting him. Give a dog a bad name, just so keep repeating the same thing. Holocaust denier, Holocaust denier. He's a fascist. And then ultimately, and then people say, hey, do we really want to invite him to this? Do we really want to associate with him? So that, then this turning point will think, well, maybe, we're going to lose people if we have Tucker Carlson. I don't think that's going to work. But I think that's what's going on here. That's what Ben Shapiro is doing. That's what Mark Levin is doing. They just basically just say, how do we discredit Tucker Carlson, so that once and for all, no one will want to associate with him. And as I say, that they have the Pat Buchanan model to refer to. They say that what they did to Pat Buchanan was a very deliberately timed, organized operation. It was the neoconservatives, similar people to Mark Levin, but it's an earlier generation. So it was. So there was younger people. It was like Norman Podhoretz at Commentary magazine. Then you had the Weekly Standard. All the time the constant attack on Buchanan, and then it got to the point where Buchanan was really shunned by respectable media. So I think that's um, what I think the operation. Levin is a truly disgusting um, uh, uh, person. One of the worst. I mean, he really is an Israel firsters, and who, of course, was against Trump. I mean, in 2016, he was really, attacking Trump. It was a huge attacks against him. And then he suddenly turned around and became a great supporter of Trump. But throughout 2016, he was very strongly opposed to Trump. So Levin turning around and being, oh, I'm MAGA, I'm America first, I'm more Trumpian than you are. It's a complete fraud, absolute complete fraud. Levin only cares about Israel. Ben Shapiro only cares about Israel, and they hide um, their proclivities by embracing a kind of some socially conservative views, things they don't really care that much about, gay marriage, yeah, okay, yeah, 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 transgender. What's not even gay marriage? That's already issue of yesterday. I mean, it's more, oh, transgender, yeah, yeah, I'm against transgender. We're not going to have, can't have boys in girls' locker rooms. Easy stuff that they think will endear them to the conservative movement. The right will embrace them. Oh yeah, they're with us. They're socially conservative. Families, yeah, we're family. We want families. We want children. Yeah, people should get married and have children. Oh, what a brilliant insight. Yeah, but in reality, that's not what they care about. They don't care about people having children or families or you know boys in girls' locker rooms. They only care about Israel, and for that they're willing to attack and discredit anyone. Um, and then uh, Summer Petra says, "I agree with your comments on rare earths. They ain't rare. Nope. Just that they are destructive and expensive to mine and purify." Yeah, that's right. And some people say, "I don't want to do that." And the Chinese say, "Oh no, we'll do it." We don't care that much about the environment. And then lo and behold, they suddenly have a near monopoly in the world. But that's not because of anything that they did so brilliantly. It's just nobody else wanted to do it. Um, and where are we? Yep. Yeah. Um, and then Dennis Misty says, Max Blumenthal has presented a piece on Venezuela. Oh, has he? Okay. Well, look forward to reading that. Well, that's interesting. Anyway, thank you so much, Dennis. Really appreciate it. And all right, I think my time is coming to an end. Thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all your comments and questions. And thank you above all to everyone who put something into the tip jar, because the routine. Wednesday, the dogs wake up, they look at the tip jar, then all hell breaks loose. This is even worse than we expected. And then they take out their anger on me. So, thank you, everyone who's just help me, and just I'll be able to have an argument to present to the dogs. So thank you for today, and we'll be back Thursday at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and let's watch for the election results today. There might still be some interesting results. Probably not, but it might still be quite exciting. I guess that they're going to be coming in a few hours' time, so that should be fun. Thank you, and see you Thursday. All the best. Good night. Bye bye.